Well, the reason I wanted to do this was I had lived here. Well, we bought our place in '76, and 3 years later, that pile of bricks with a view, it became a livable place. So we moved in '79, December '79. And much of it had happened. By that time, I-95 was roaring past and all the rest. And I went to meetings, but I couldn't make sense out of it all. So much had gone on that I felt I really didn't know. And I assumed that if I, who lived here 34 years, didn't know, there were a few others that might not know. So it seemed like a good time to get the crew together that had been vital in what Queen Village is now. Thanks to them, we have a Queen Village. It might have been a very different place without them. And I wanted to start with Marge, who's lived here for a long time. Oh, incidentally, this is an Indian talking stick. The chief holds this, and he passes it to anyone. I don't think we'll need it, but if we do, and I remember meetings where you wish that both of you wish that...
Yeah.
But if you take this and hold it like this and fill it, it would be a lot better meeting.
Okay. Well, anyway, we hope not to use it, but first off, I want to get Marge to talk a little bit about what Queen Village was like before I-95, before all of the chaos started, and then we'll pick up on I-95 and take it from there. There's an outline in your program, and I'd appreciate if you don't ask questions now and get the whole picture, and then we'll begin, leave an open time for questions. We'll have a brief break and have question time. Go, Marge.
Thank you. I'm Marge Schernecke. I now live at 846 South Front Street, but I'm 5 generations in the community. We have found many things in the house that my parents and my grandparents and my great-grandparents lived in at 852. One of the things that we found was a letter from the American consul in Melbourne, Australia in 1847, it stated, has the watermark. It's notifying my great-great-grandmother that her husband had died at sea, and it was forwarding his belongings to her. At that time, they lived, I believe, at 7 Christian Street. But that's how long my family has been here, and I must say that I'm not the only one. There are a lot of other families in the community that have very, very deep roots in this area. Growing up here, I recall that the community was always both racially, religiously, ethnically diverse. I mean, everyone at that point was on the same economic level. Many of the people that I grew up with and went to school with lived around the corner, down the street. We may have gone to different schools. We all went to Shot Tower Playground. There were congregations of us that went to Auspitz Church. And that's the kind of community that it was when we grew up in. I mean, you can, even today, Nesner Synagogue, Philip's Temple, all of the various, St. Philip Neri, St. Stanislaus. I mean, that's the kind of community that it was. Plus, we had South Street to shop, and you knew when shopping day was, you knew the neighbors, who they would go to, who they would recommend to buy produce and things like that. Well, the houses on Front Street, I can remember as a kid growing up, my grandfather would say, someday there's going to be a highway across the street, and not really wanting to believe that. But in those days, the attitude of the people were, you can't fight City Hall. There's going to be a highway there, there's going to be a highway there. And there was nothing that you could do about it. The houses on Front Street were all vacated in the mid-60s. After residents were forced to move, the houses were systematically stripped by poachers, and it was heartbreaking to see. They took everything that was historically significant, fireplaces, molding, decorative wrought ironwork, copper piping, all those kinds of things. The other thing that I wanted to mention was the fact that in those days, you know, again, the attitude was you can't fight City Hall, but there was a strong group around Auspitz Church that did try to have it moved. And there were arguments back and forth over those years in the 60s about, will it go to 3rd Street? Will it come to Front Street? Well, they finally settled on the east side of Front. And those homes, as I said, were vacated in the mid-60s. Calls were made to PennDOT and the city planning, but nothing was done to stop any of that thievery. Actual demolition of the houses on Front Street started in 66 and 67, And though I lived on the west side of the street, I remember that we grouped together and watched, standing with our neighbors, we watched their houses demolished. And it was very heartbreaking to see a house that your best friend lived in, just be torn down, where you shared so many memories with them. Around that time, and I'm sorry that she's not here tonight, because I wanted to especially recognize Ellen Riviere, because Queen Village was declared an urban renewal area in 1969 or 70. That's when QBNA was formed. The original articles of incorporation and all that were done by Decker, Price, and Rhodes, pro bono. And we were part of an area called the South Central Project Area Committee, South Central PAC. And that was made up of communities from the west side of the Schuylkill to down here in our waterfront. So it was made up of Queen Village, Bella Vista, Hawthorne. Then there was something called the Forgotten Community, and on the west side of Broad was an area near the Royal Theater that was very strong, and George Dukes had a community also toward the west side over there. Our office, our main office, was at 1527 South Street, and George and Alice Lipscomb were chair and co-chair of the South Central PAC. John Coates, and I'm sorry John's not here tonight too, was the first director of the South Central Project Area Committee. That's when the boundaries of Queen Village were established by the City Planning Commission, the bulkheads of the Delaware River to the east side of 6th, from the south side of Lombard Street to the north side of Washington Avenue. And that's when, well, I've subsequently read from Paul's book, and you should really read that also, The Eclipse of Community, and where Father Fee from St. Philip's actually coined the name because of Queen Christina and Queen Catherine, right. Well, the other thing I'd like to say at that time was the crosstown. One of the reasons I think that the South Central PAC became so powerful is because we were diverse, and we represented the communities up and down the South Bainbridge corridor. But also, and that's one of the things I wanted to thank Ellen Riviere for. In those days when you can't fight City Hall attitude was around, back in the 60s, up in Massachusetts, there was a young black fellow up there whose community was being displaced. He was an attorney. He organized them, and he didn't want them displaced, and he took his fight to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, and it was because there was a federal program or a federal project that was going to force the relocation of these people. At that time, he fought and, as I said, went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that any type of program that was federally funded required community participation. That was one of the first things that Ellen Riviere brought to me, was a copy of this article about this young man, and about the fact that any time federal money was involved, community participation was required. And that's really how I think we began to organize and to understand that we did have input. We forced them to give us input. The first QBNA president was Paul Coyne in 1969, followed by Carol Carey. My husband, Alex, 1973-74. I was president around 1975 and 76. Conrad, 1977-78. And Paul, I think you followed Conrad. And I have a picture up here. It was called the Plastic Flower Election, because we were opposed by a group of people who thought we were the old timers and didn't like the people who had plastic flowers in their windows. We kind of liked it, Anyway, we convinced the South Central PAC that we needed an office in Queen Village, and that's when we fought very hard to get an office. And the staff will come later. I'll let Conrad and Kathy explain that. But the crosstown, we fought very hard to get the crosstown wiped from the city maps. And that was because we united with a group called the South Street Renaissance, the 4th Street Business Association, the South Street Businessmen's Association, and all the groups up and down the river. And I'm going to let David talk about how those meetings went at 1527 South Street, but they were pretty rough and tumble in those days. But I think that we were able, because of the community participation aspect of it, achieve a lot of goals, particularly when it came to the ramps and the subsequent work that was done. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess it's a hard act to follow, and seeing myself with hair here was a very interesting picture. I moved to the neighborhood in 1976 here to the 200 block of Queen Street. But I want to sort of go back and set a little bit of context for the neighborhood because, Marge talked about it personally, but, this was a manufacturing city in the 19th century. More than half of the entire workforce in the city was in manufacturing. And there's a wonderful book written about the Polish community in particular by a woman named Carolyn Golab called Immigrant Destinations. And she has a wonderful map of this neighborhood from 1920, just to pick up on something that Marge said. In this neighborhood in 1920, there were 44 different religious congregations, essentially from the river to 6th Street, from south down to Washington. There were 5 different Catholic churches, 23 different Jewish synagogues. There were Lutheran, Episcopal, Baptist churches, and these were largely ethnic, so that there was a Polish Catholic, a Lithuanian Catholic, there was a German Jewish, there was a Russian and Polish, so very, very much separated, if you will, or into different immigrant identities. You had a Swedish church, a German church, and as I said, African American church. As you know, the history of this in a lot of cities is a decline in manufacturing, but still as late as 1950, 34%, a third of the city's workforce was in manufacturing. So keep that in mind. And the thing to understand about the neighborhood is because we were a manufacturing city, we were an exporting city. We had things that got made here that got exported, which means the port worked 2 ways. It means there was tons of product that was being shipped out and then things being shipped in. And if you know the current situation where we're 90 miles up to Delaware, it's not economically competitive when we're going against Baltimore or New York, but when we were a manufacturing city, it was worth coming 90 miles up because there was a tremendous amount that was being exported here. And so Barry has a couple of these. I didn't bring enough, but there's a picture that Barry, I've got about 12 of these. This is the Central Waterfront in 1930. And so what you'll see here, if you just take a look at it and circulate it around, what you will see is the area from the Ben Franklin Bridge all the way down to the Walt Whitman Bridge, which wasn't built at the time, in which every single pier, the Finger Pier, was an incredibly active pier. And so you had most of the people in what was, today's Society Hill, Queen Village, Pennsport. The primary place of employment for these neighborhoods was the waterfront. So you had very skilled workers, shipbuilders, repair people, but you had a lot of daily labor. You had people who lived on 4th or 5th Street who just walked to the piers. If a ship came in, there were things to be loaded and unloaded. So think about the entire neighborhood as oriented around the waterfront work. And clearly, and then so you've got Delaware Avenue, and then you'll see these gigantic warehouses. If you can visualize the warehouse that today is at Spring Garden in Delaware, it's one of the remaining ones. A great number of the blocks between Front and Delaware had warehouses of that scale, and then row houses, as Marge indicated, sort of sandwiched in between. But if you think about the city losing manufacturing, it meant that the port was in decline. So the port is in decline, jobs are going down, and then something we all take for granted today, containerization of cargo. The big, huge containers which can come right off of ships onto trucks. New facilities were built up in Port Richmond, Tioga, the one that you see down by the Walt Whitman Bridge at Packer. Very efficient, but not very labor intensive. So that meant that these piers were obsolete, a further decline in jobs on the waterfront. And so the neighborhood, Marge talks about the vital parts of the neighborhood, but it's a neighborhood that's losing people and losing jobs at that period of time. So the most deteriorated section of the city was the old food distribution center, which is today where Society Hill Towers. That curved street was where, and that's where the city started its renewal efforts. A really interesting story I recently discovered is that when the city put in the application for its first urban renewal grant for what we today call Society Hill, the folks in Washington said, too deteriorated, too risky, make your first renewal area in Rittenhouse Square. That's a safer investment. So you get a sense of the image of the area at the time. The city persisted, so you have a neighborhood in decline from an employment point of view. All of these blocks, all of these neighborhoods were redlined. You could not get a mortgage. The entire area, it didn't matter whether you were white, black, Hispanic. There's simply no mortgage money was available in these neighborhoods commercially until 1968. So you can't reinvest in the neighborhood, and it was a period of time where moving up meant moving out. I mean, it's a period of time of tremendous suburbanization. I remember Kathy telling me a story about some of her friends who moved out. You still living down in the old neighborhood, like there was something wrong with Kathy, who now is one of the highest grossing salespeople selling houses in this neighborhood. But that was the time, so you have people moving out. And I think the way to think about the neighborhood, I just pulled up numbers. 1960, there were 6,777 people living in the neighborhood. 1970, it was down to 4,500. As Marge said, 56% white, 44% African American. And among the white ethnics, 27% of the population was first or second generation. So you had lots of people in Marge's community or in Kathy's community who had 15, 20 relatives in the area. A very, very long-term immigrant community that was here. By 80, the population had gone down to 3,900. I'll tell you, it's back up to 4,500 with the number of households up by 42%. Why? Because a lot smaller households than people, households with lots of kids and grandparents, etc. But the mapping of the neighborhood, and some of those who were here may correct me on some of this, but front to third was the most stable portion in the neighborhood at that time. It was still largely Polish, Irish, Lithuanian in that area. Third to fifth had been the Jewish garment district, the Jewish business area. David's family's business was there. So walking down tonight, remember the scene was a kosher wine store. Jewish butchers along there, and through the wonderful ironies of urban life, the African-American Muslims in Southwark shopped at the kosher butchers here because they weren't going to shop at other butchers. So you had this very, very interesting sort of mix, but the Jewish population that had been here was most mobile and moved out in many cases. And so into that affordable housing, you had a large African-American population move in, although Jim Smith, wife's family, Pelzers had been here 50 years, maybe more, 60 years. So you have a very long-standing African-American community here. And just, you know, what you had then is a neighborhood in which one, imagine like, you know, these big beach balls and you start letting the air out. The neighborhood's still there, but the air is going out of it in some sense because of jobs. 50s and 60s downtown renewal is beginning, so new office buildings are being built. Thomas Jefferson, Hahnemann, Penn, a whole series of new employers are emerging. What's so amazing today is 47% of you work downtown. More than half of the population now is working in Center City, obviously not on the waterfront. And just to catch up and pick up some of the themes, and then I'll stop, you know, the priority for renewal in the 50s and 60s was linking the downtown into the region by highways. And so the other map I put in there is this sort of Ed Bacon 1963 plan for the community. This is the renewal plan. And you'll see a very nice frame. There's I-95 in the foreground, the Schuylkill in the distance, Vine Street to the north, something that you've heard about, the Crosstown Expressway. And then remember like those maps of the 16th century, terra incognito, right? South of South, who knows what's going on down there, right? So it's off the map. And so this was a priority, and in fairness, remember, they thought Society Hill was a huge risk. And so you begin to get this plan to rebuild the downtown linked by highways. Schuylkill was built first in the 50s. Demolition, as Marge said, for I-95 is 66 and 67. We'll talk about how it took a long time. But that is federally funded, 90% federal money. And the people who are the renewal planners are saying, we don't have enough money to deal with blight. Let's use some of this highway money to deal with blight as well. And so clearing out what they called blight was, the highway became a tool for doing that. And I guess just to sort of wrap up, you know, the last image which I want to come back and talk about is we took this Crosstown Expressway footprint, which is river to river, essentially Lombard to Bainbridge, which is the red line across this map, figured out the real estate taxes paid in 1972 when it was stricken, which was $345,000 a year, and this year the properties in that neighborhood pay $9,700,000 in real estate taxes. So if anybody ever tells you if you tear down a highway there won't be real estate, you got the reverse case proved here. And it was the defeat of this highway which actually opens up the neighborhood to investment. Because you have people looking at these incredibly expensive houses in Society Hill, $40,000 in 1970, outrageous, okay? The median price in the city was $12,000. And rehab houses in this neighborhood sold FHA insured for $10,600. So for people who were working downtown, it was a huge bargain. So you have this highway network underway. You have an older neighborhood whose manufacturing jobs are in decline, but lots of people still here, and a whole group of new people, so they're expanding from Center City. So I'll stop there. We'll get back to the narrative that goes next.
Could you elaborate a bit on I-95 and how you stopped it, moved it from Third to Front?
Yeah, I think that predates virtually all of us, but I think as Marge said, there were plans for I-95 from the 40s, and it was part of I mean, if you go to every region, you'll see an outer loop, you can see around the Beltway in Washington, and then there's going to be inner loop. And there were plans that was going to be 7th Street, then in the 50s it was moved to 3rd Street. A lot of people were arguing to move it all the way to Delaware Avenue, but if you look at that historical image, you understand that the railroad owned Delaware Avenue. The railroad was, as somebody said, the lifeline in the port. And so, oh my God, we can't conflict with the railroad, which is now long dead. And so I-95 went into the default place, which was the declining, abandoned warehouses, but lots of intact row houses in there. And so all of that gets demolished in 66 and 67. And I didn't move until 76, but the highway was not open at that time. I think Conrad and others can pick up with the consent decree. But we had one of the greatest jogging and bicycle trails in the city for a long time. I-95 built but not open for at least 3 to 4 years.
Okay, because it was bad enough trying to figure out what to say after Marge. Then Paul Levy, okay? If anybody like to throw in like either an animal act or a couple kids tap dancing before I go on, I have absolutely nothing to say. A couple quick notes.
There's never a moment when David has nothing to say.
Don't believe it.
First of all, I hear you. Frank Rizzo said, no neighborhood's going to swallow anything they don't want, and that's what we were often running. And I can't give you all the details the way they can, and there's a couple things, though, that I really want to bring out, and you touched on it very quickly about the people who were involved in this fight, and there were so many. I want to mention Marge Niblock's name only for the fact that she was terrific in what she did, and also, there's not many names I remember anymore, so Marge Niblock came to mind. But she was wonderful, and if she was in town, she would be here.
She would.
400 block of Lombard.
Yeah, exactly. But when Rizzo said that, there was a group down here that really took the ball and went for the touchdown. And if you look at their careers after this, in all seriousness, and we joke around, but between Conrad and I, we basically, Queen Village ran the zoning board of Philadelphia for 16 years, based out of the model that was created by Conrad, and then when he moved up, I followed him. And that model, the letter that they send everybody for zoning to this day, was based on the original letter that Conrad wrote. I took it, made it look like it was my own words, and we kept going from there. But it is amazing that most of the modern day zoning came out of Queen Village and the members of that whole Queen Village Neighbors Zoning Committee. Margie, still politically, they turn to her. What, you know, is the guy going to win or not? She usually hits it right, and she's a great oracle for the feeling of the people. And I don't want to just brag about it. And Paul Levy, okay, please get this on tape. I want to be the first to ask him at some point in his life to run for mayor of Philadelphia, okay? But he has, his Center City District basically redefined, recreated all of Philadelphia. It's awesome what he accomplished. And
I learned it all from these guys.
Probably my biggest contribution to the I-95 fight was that we used to buy cars and like block 4th Street or something, so the trolley was blocked at the time, and disrupt traffic and everything. And I used to finance and buy a car for $25, and we paint all over it. I stop I-95 and all that. And then Don Fagan, and his son told me he had a problem with the law. I don't know why. He was at a picnic or something, and they arrested him for coke. I don't understand it, but he. Don Fagan couldn't make it tonight either. But the bottom line is that there was a whole group of people who were a little bit more militant than the average bear was on the other side. And John Hunt would have been here tonight, but we still owe him money. So, I understand why he wouldn't appear unless we gave him a check in advance this time. But I want to go on, and I'll be there for color, and I'll tell you some of the interesting stories that we figured out the other day, that the statute of limitations is up, so we can say basically anything we want, and there's nothing they can do about it. We've been open and blatant for the last 30 years, so we're okay. And I want to move on to Kathy, and then we'll be happy to take any questions you have. I'm sorry, Conrad, so that way.
Well, I'd like Kathy to talk for a minute about I-95 and some of the techniques that she used on I-95 to try and stop it, along with the cars.
It was a devastating period, actually, when they were taking down the houses. That was a dark, dank area in all of our lives that we lived here. And it was, what could we do, what could we do? And obviously, we got, I started my, that started in the 60s, but I started to work for Queen Village Neighbors in the 70s as a secretary. And we opened the office at 736 South 3rd Street. That there was a wonderful Portuguese gentleman who had a water ice stand there. And we were at 15th and South, and it was like so far away from Queen Village, the South Central Pack. We asked, could we please get an office in Queen Village, and Marge and Conrad and everyone worked hard to see if we could get one. And we just went up to Mr. Resende and said, could we use your water ice? He had one room in the front of his building, and he said, sure. So I started in 1976. Conrad hired me as the secretary. I took Patrick, my son, with me up there with a bucket, and we cleaned this terrible front room, and that's where a lot of the real trouble started. I was quiet and simple and
Sweet.
Sweet.
And by the way, we spared all expenses paid.
But what happened is I got involved with, I call us the rat pack. But we were radicals, we really were, because nothing came by right. We had to literally fight for everything that you had tonight. We really did. We fought day and night, around the clock. We literally did that when we were fighting the billboards, and they were digging holes, and we were defying trash trucks or cement trucks from pouring cement into the holes. We literally had baby carriages and brigades and phone banks where we called everyone, and the cement trucks were coming during the night trying to pour the cement. So there was 20 applications taken for billboards. We had one billboard, and that snuck in. And that was really a wonderful effort on everyone's part. So, but that was just about billboards. But the I-95, Conrad can speak more to that, but what I can remember most is, you know, we had to stay one step ahead of everything that the city was trying to do for us. They tried the highway. Unfortunately, we got it, but as diligent as we were and as radical as we were, and with the citizen participation, we got the ramps where we wanted them, not where they wanted them. We were writing our own history. They weren't going to write it. We decided that after we got the highway, and incidentally, there are still some trucks that blow their horn from Lombard to Washington Avenue, some old truck drivers who remember that we kept them, they would have to get off at line and go around, so they were really angry that they had to get off. But as Paul said, we loved it. It was our playground for 4 or 5 years. We jogged, we rode bikes, we did whatever we wanted on the highway. We didn't ever want to open. It was just a fun place to be. But getting back to after we got the highway and the ramps and where we wanted them, not where they wanted them to go. We said, well, what do we do now? What do we need now? What naturally comes along with it is, what about the noise? What can we do about this noise situation? So we said, we need sound barriers in the city. Sound barriers, they were sort of unheard of at that time. So as a group, we went out and we said, how high and what kind of sound barriers, and we held clothes props behind the houses on Front Street and with sheets and saying, is this high enough? Now, you would have to...
Let me flesh that out, because we were behind the houses on Front Street. We took these two big poles, and we stapled sheets to them, because they want a 6-foot sound barrier, an 8-foot sound barrier. So Kathy would get the neighbors out there, we were holding these poles, this is 8 feet, this is 10 feet, and people say, I don't want that wall behind my house, because
Yeah, we had warehouses, terrible warehouses, all the time. They looked at the warehouses. Then when we lost the warehouses
They had a great
and all the
view.
houses, they saw the water. It was like, we wanted to be lower. We don't want to lose our water views. It was like, oh my goodness, we can't win. But in any event, we compromised and we did get the values.
There was something else that I would like to interject. Herb Conway is sitting over there, and he has been attributed, right, the lovely landscaping and everything that's there, that is maintained by Barry Promos, who's sitting up here. He's the director of Interstate Land Management Group. But Herb's idea was to do something with that land that was over there. And it was Herb who has been, in one of the Queen Village criers that Conrad wrote, that you were the one, and we owe you a big round of applause for that idea, for the parking and the landscaping that's there. Thank you, Herb.
Did you want to say more about the crosstown, and
Yeah, I
then we
think
wanted
Conrad
to get
about
to
the highway.
the ramps?
All right, so
Okay,
About the NBC?
go ahead.
Yeah.
okay, well, thank you very much. This is really a wonderful occasion. I hadn't thought much about I-95 for a while, but I've been doing a lot of thinking lately. And I don't know, as a political scientist, I guess I'm always trying to analyze things, but there were a lot of factors that went into this, and Marge and I and the others, Paul, David, and Kathy, we were talking, and it seems that one of the things that helped us, I guess, was that the idea of neighborhood activism was still a new idea, and we sort of took that idea and ran with it. I think some of us were sort of inspired by the civil rights movement, and the PennDOT people especially, they were like deer in the headlights when we would, David, it was sort of like the 1-2 punch. It would be like, well, this is the reasonable idea, and then if you don't like the reasonable idea, well then...
Here's Marge.
So that was a factor, but that's just sort of in the background. But from a historical point of view, the Neighborhood Preservation Coalition was the group that was formed to fight the ramps and then to get to the noise barriers. And I don't know when I became the head of it, but I was the head of it when the barriers were in play.
Can I interrupt just factually here, okay?
Mhm.
So you have a crosstown expressway which was going to link I-95 and Scoopville. When that gets defeated in 1972, you got these highways with no place to get off. So the ramps are a byproduct of the fact, okay, the crosstown's defeated, but now they got to get traffic off. And so the ramps are, okay, the crosstown's gone, but now we got something new for you, which is ramps that come into the neighborhood. So that's the transition, sorry.
Yeah, so the ramps would have been, in effect, a de facto crosstown without the name. And so I was involved, but other people were leading the initial effort to fight the ramps. And John Hunt was a lawyer. I think Rick Snyderman was involved, and a number of people, and filed a lawsuit under the Environmental Protection Act, which Marge had talked about, because a few years earlier the federal rules required citizen participation, and they hadn't done a proper environmental impact statement, and so we got into court on that, and after a couple of years in court, we got a consent decree. Well, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but the demonstrations and the protest eventually resulted in the city and the state relenting on the ramps. And then we got a consent decree. The consent decree then promised noise barriers, and that's, I think, when I became the president of the coalition. But let me just back up a little
And
bit.
those were to protect us from Marge and David, that's why we needed
The Neighborhood Preservation Coalition was from Pennsport to Queen Village, Society Hill, Elfris Alley, Old City, and then I think also Washington Square West and maybe Bella Vista were involved, but they weren't very active. And Pennsport. They were not.
They did not sign
They didn't sign it.
as a member, but they
Right.
kind of
And
participated.
therefore it took them 20 more years to get the sound barrier.
That's right.
Yeah. So it was kind of a juggling act, trying to keep all these disparate neighborhoods together on the same page. I think, I don't know, maybe that was when the phrase herding cats was coined. I think, but it was certainly, and I think that was my job, although some groups were much better to work with than others. But there was, a certain amount of animosity. Some people didn't like other people. I don't know if I should get into any specifics. And then near the end, the one neighborhood decided that they didn't want to fight for noise barriers. And so we had sort of a major problem in the northern part of our coalition. We managed to hold that together until, and this is where I guess where the political scientist comes out. We had a sort of a crisis when Fishtown wanted to open I-95 further south. And because people were getting off at Girard Avenue. That was in, I think, summer of '78. And we had already been promised the noise barriers, but we had not been given the money. And Fishtown was threatening to open, to protest, and they had a lot of political clout. We had a lot of political clout too. Fortunately, Mayor Rizzo was very sympathetic to this neighborhood and Pennsport. And, but this could have been the thing that broke it, but instead we decided to broaden the arena of conflict, as we say, and we called a meeting in Fishtown. I think this was sort of a crucial point when we had representatives of the U.S. Highway Department and PennDOT, the city. We had state senators, state representatives, we had congressmen, and city council people, and everybody was together in the same room. And it could have been a nuclear explosion, but thank God it worked. And they agreed to support us to get the money and to get the barriers, and we agreed to open the highway down to Callow Hill Street, where there is still an exit now, but the rest of I-95 still was not completed. But that was, in some ways, a turning point. And I just remember constantly juggling all these different neighborhoods and the personalities and trying to keep them all on the same page. And also, actually, I think I was still doing the zoning committee at the same time, too. So it was a very busy time. Then the struggle was simply to make sure PennDOT actually got the money and did the barriers. And Paul was working very hard on designing the barriers. And we got that agreement, fortunately, just in time, because the Northeast Philly began to get very angry at what they perceived to be the blockage of I-95. In fact, I-95 was not completed, but they had it in their head that it was. And so from summer of '78, when we had this meeting in Fishtown, to August of '79, when the highway was actually opened, we were increasingly getting bad publicity and getting pressure and threats and demonstrations. And at the culmination of the battle, well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but we were eventually called into court in front of the judge in the summer of '79, and there was an energy crisis going on, President Carter, and then it looked as though we were going to have to open the highway. We were trying to keep the highway shut, but now it was actually physically finished, so I think we were only actually keeping it shut for maybe 2 or 3 months after it was physically finished. And we went in and we eventually agreed. The judge pretty much told us that we had to agree, or else he was just going to open it anyway. And we had to persuade some of our own people. It was pretty tough, at that moment when you have to tell your own people, well, the fight is kind of over, at least for this phase. And that was a very difficult moment. And I remember, I think it was the day before we made that agreement, I had 16 media interviews on that day. And some of them I did from the ShopRite down, I forget what street, on Water Street, and some of them I did from a telephone in the ShopRite. And I was making dinner, and a New York Times reporter asked me questions while I was cooking dinner. And I said, I hope this is over soon, because I don't think I can keep this up. But fortunately, certain things went our way, and even though the highway was open, without the barriers, the money had been appropriated. Senator Fumo and other politicians did really keep their word. At that time, they were on our side, and eventually the noise barriers were built. So thank goodness it did work out. But it was a tribute to really hard work of a great many people. And I guess, you know, a little bit of luck also. And one final thing I would say is, in the background, I think, was the fact that many people also kept political contacts. It was one thing to be a nonpartisan civic group, and that really was powerful. But it also helped that, you know, in different ways, some people had connections to the politicians outside, sometimes outside of the civic group. But we already had a profile in Philadelphia from zoning and from other fights. So the politicians fortunately knew who we were. That helped also with this, because they already knew that this was a group that you know, they needed to pay attention to. I'm sorry this is a little disjointed, but anyway, so I'll stop there.
One thing that I wanted to mention about the sound barriers, which I think is important or significant, is the fact that they had never been done before by PennDOT anywhere in the state, okay?
Right,
at
and they
least.
thought it was crazy.
They thought we
Minnesota,
They thought it was
crazy.
insane.
And we had to literally drag them kicking and screaming to the table to even start discussing that. After they were in place,
Right.
you know, we saw these guys later, Frank Sorrentino, Harvey Nauer, they were going all over the country. We made them experts. They were going all over the country talking about these sound barriers.
Yeah, let me tell my version. I guess a couple things, I think, you know, because I sort of joked about this, but I mean, I sort of have grown up to be a kind of reasonable person and look for compromise. And I think David's strength and Marge's strength a lot during that period of time was to say, hell no, we're not
Right.
compromising.
Yeah.
That is, I mean,
David was good at that.
right. And that was incredibly important to be unreasonable at the time, because there was this completely unreasonable thing happening. I think the balancing act was, once the cards were kind of dealt, and we knew that the highway was going to open, we had this idea that there would be sound barriers, and then, you know, Herbie's idea of this, we then hired Cecil Baker, who is still in town, and his firm, Baker, Rothschild, Horn and Blythe, was on the Candy Court, or whatever it was called, right on American Street. And we were out there in the park that runs from what used to be Rick Sirianni's place, I don't even know who, the bistro,
Right.
on up to South Street. We went to this incredible allocation because there were some people who wanted parking. We had a desperate parking problem. Other people wanted park. And what you're looking at is this block by block compromise of how much green, how much parking. And we were back and forth, and we were at Tom Sam's house, and we were meeting with Harvey Knauer and with Frank Sorrentino from PennDOT, and literally going, and I remember coming back to Queen Village Neighbors meetings, and people are saying, don't compromise, don't accept it, because they were going to put fences right at the edge of Front Street, and then the highway was going to slant down, and all of that fill that goes out to the highway was backfilled in, so that there's a retaining wall that was built, that was all filled in. There was a lot of people who were saying, don't compromise at all, and so we had to find when was it an appropriate time to compromise.
Just show people
Yeah.
this was PennDOT's idea. These would be the houses on the west side of Front Street.
Right.
This would be Front Street. Their idea was to put a 30-foot wall right there on the east side of Front Street. And then this would be the slope down to the highway. And then the idea that Herb and Paul worked on was, no, move the noise barrier down to the edge of the highway and fill this in and make a park. And all of these things were like, you know, ideas from Mars, PennDOT people.
Yeah, we were taking pictures, like they have sound barriers in California, they have sound barriers in Minneapolis, and of course people are, that's Minneapolis, that's not Philadelphia,
right.
we don't have those. And just to flesh out Marge's story, in 1981 or 82, I got a call from Harvey Knauer saying, would I come speak to a group of highway engineers, and they were meeting at the Holiday Inn at 4th and Arch, and Harvey was being given an award for community involvement. He was beaten over the head. And it was one of those moments you want to stand up and say, God damn it, he doesn't deserve the award. But it's like, you know, we made him a hero by saying how great it was, because here suddenly this was being held up as the model of community engagement. And it was a battle the whole way. But once I think that was built, I think, to me, that sort of compromise of how that was worked out, and then obviously Barry maintains it now. But just again, because he's in jail now, we need to give him credit. I mean, the senator, I mean, the money would not have been there had not FUMO appropriated. I remember, I talked about this with Conrad, we went up by train for the signing of the bill by then Governor Casey. And at that point, John, we joked about him not always getting paid his bills, but he had done a ton of work, and he had real paying cases, and we're on the train trying to talk about the case and stuff, and John was doing his law business, and we're like, John's not gonna be prepared for this. We go in, it all gets worked out, the governor signs the bill, and then I remember, because we went up by train, that the senator offered us a ride back in his car, and this was, he had one of the earliest car phones, then of course he was driving 85 miles an hour on the turnpike, but we came back with the money for the sound barriers because of him, so he did deliver stuff.
One thing I'd also like to say, and I think Kathy can back me up about us being obstinate, and David too, and
Why don't you hold up your
uncompromising.
t-shirt? Right.
You know, yeah, well, you know,
Let's face it,
Gene
Rizzo
didn't
loved
believe
you.
that this was worn by me at one time. David swears that he saw me wear it. Anyway, growing up here, we saw 200, and I always say that, and it was at least 200, it was somewhere between 200 and 300, historically certified or certifiable houses demolished. Whole courtyards down by Auspitz Church, which was a lovely part of the area. If you see these pictures here, there's a book out, Philadelphia, and all the photographs. Southward, Queen Village is the first part of that group. And these photographs taken from the tower and Shaw Tower show the whole panorama of what the neighborhood used to be like. It's gone. So if we were uncompromising, you know, we just felt like we were being pushed. And then when they came back with ramps and they wanted to take more houses on Front Street between South and Bainbridge, I think we said we had enough, you know.
Yeah.
Well, there was also
And it was really working place for the cafe.
But what happened then, though, when, at South and Bainbridge? I mean, what?
Well, that's where they wanted to, you know,
First
first of
ramp
all,
was
the
there.
first
Yeah, I
ramps
mean,
were
the
proposed.
I mean,
Yeah,
For
can you
that
talk a
work.
little bit about the ramps, and particularly for
Well,
some of
again,
us
you
are a
have
little-
you have a highway that's going north-south that was going to connect to an east-west. So they wanted to get people into the downtown, so there were off-ramps that were going to come up at Bainbridge and go on to South Street and Lombard Street, and they were going to be the same on the other side. So they would feed in just like the way the Vine Street ramps feed into surface Vine Street. And I think all you have to do is look at Vine Street today to see that there's a highway and then there's supposedly surface roads, but they're really huge parking lots. So it really would have been devastating to the neighborhood. And the consent decree was you can't build those ramps into the neighborhood. They have to go Riverside.
Right.
They have to go the other side.
They were going to change the direction of South Street.
Right.
And so South and Lombard would cut across town, and most of this, to be very honest with you, was racial. They wanted a divide between Society Hill and us, being everybody below Society Hill. And it was all about building up Society Hill. If you want to take a shot at Dilworth and Clark, I would never do that.
Will always.
There are
I was
rumors
told
around,
to
this
help
is a rumor.
save his house, and I wouldn't save his house for anything. You know how many houses he was responsible for demolishing in our neighborhood?
There was a rumor that maybe in the area of the land they call Society Hill, I don't know if this is true, you can put it on camera, don't even repeat this until somebody verifies it. But maybe an inspector used to go into a house that was worth about $5,000, and they would say, oh my God, you need electrical work, you need plumbing work, this house is horrible, we're gonna throw you out of your house, you gotta leave right now, it's imminent danger. Maybe the next day a realtor would show up and say, you know, I like this house, I'll give you $4,000 for it. Maybe people bought up blocks and blocks of real estate, and then they named it the magic place of Society Hill. So, and I don't know that to be true, but that's a story I've heard from news, is it?
Yeah, I heard it from my father.
Well, if he said, so,
Yeah.
maybe it's true. Conrad is the source. But the bottom line is that this was all about them against us being thrown right in with just the plain old run-of-the-mill racial stuff which was going on during the whole civil rights era and everything else. It was an awesome period of time. And the surge of energy was unbelievable. And this is the first time, quote, I remember as a kid down here where white kids didn't go past the east side of 4th Street, and African Americans didn't come down to 4th Street, and that was the dividing line, and you didn't meet in between. Then all of a sudden this thing starts, and everybody's working together. It's like, it was unbelievable.
You had a bigger enemy.
Huh?
You had a bigger enemy.
You had a bigger enemy, and also it was an era when people really wanted to get together and do the right thing. And it was a wonderful period of time on many live. But I just want to give you two things, because to give you a little color of what was happening there. And I don't want to keep cutting you off, I promise you. They're going to call on you, because I know you want to say something.
I've got a really loud voice.
Welcome to the club. Welcome to the club. But the one thing I want to tell you, two quick things that happened. There's a one-term city councilman named Greenberg. And as much as I like smear politics, it was tough to pin him as an anti-Semite. But Greenberg was from the Northeast. I'm glad somebody got that, thank you. And he was organized a cavalcade of cars to come through Queen Village to protest.
Right.
They would drive past our houses.
Right, and the night before, somebody found a rifle along the route in the bushes. So the police canceled his cavalcade, and Greenberg canceled his cavalcade real quick. The other thing is, somebody shot a cement truck.
PennDOT truck, wounded, one of our neighbors, and that neighbor of mine, wounded a PennDOT truck one evening. They were working from like 6 to, till maybe, 6 in the morning on a Sunday night. And he watched every Sunday night, what was it, the FBI with F. Zibilis Jr., right? His favorite program. And that was it. He couldn't get any television reception. And he went up to his 3rd floor and he got a rifle and he wounded a PennDOT truck. And I had police, I had investigators at my house because I only lived down the street. Wasn't anybody in my family, and we just said, who it was. They knew the angle it came from and all that, but that's frustration,
I wanted to bring up another piece of Queen Village. Let me give you a little bit of my background here. I first found out about Queen Village in 1967. There was a fella whose name a lot of you guys I know will recognize, a fella who was a law student at University of Pennsylvania. Put together a group which ended up being, at that time, initially, 15 people, which were 14 second-year law students and me, to invest in an area called Queen Village. This fellow's name is Craig Smith.
We know.
And Craig,
Saw him 2 nights ago.
Craig, people have various opinions of Craig, but I was on the board of initially the Pembroke Street Association and then the Southwick Housing Development Association, the corporation. And there's a piece of this whole discussion that you're having that I think hasn't been mentioned, and that's the construction of housing. The Crosstown Expressway, as horrible as it was, I know that from our standpoint as part of Southwark, created a hell of an opportunity because we were able to buy shell houses for $1,500, $2,000, because nobody wanted to take the shot that the Crosstown Expressway wasn't going to go through.
Yeah, let me flesh out a little bit, because I did a history of this neighborhood about 30 years ago now. So there was a moment in 1961 in this building where Father John Fee from St. Philip Neri and Saul Schoenbach, who was the head of the music school, created this organization called Queen Village Incorporated in 1961. And again, the neighborhood was fairly strong and intact from front to third, and this corridor from third to fifth was the most deteriorated area. We have friends who live on the 400 block of Fulton. I remember in the 70s there was one intact house on the Fulton, and it was just, everything was falling down in there. And they began to buy houses and buy shells, and so there was a nonprofit corporation that initially started buying up houses in this area.
There's a fellow named Madway, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Madway was the original consultant. And again, the genesis of the name, this was always South Philadelphia or Southwark for people who lived here. And here they got together and said, look, we need to brand this in a new way. And as Marge recalled, it was Queen Catherine and Queen Christian were the original suites, so let's take Queen. And then Schoenbach had come from New York City, said, well, the village has got this good feel. So Queen Village was a made-up name in 1961. And I remember interviewing both Marge and Kathy in the 70s, and at the time said, well, Queen Village was a new people's name. That was, we always called it South Philadelphia or Southwark. So you had a nonprofit corporation getting started. The whole area is FHA, it's redline. And the very first mortgages are in 1968 when redlining ends, and Phil Hoff and Carol Carey bought their houses at 3rd and Queen, right, for $10,000 each. Pat Crossan, who was Dilworth's secretary, lived in the soup kitchen house And these are some of the very earliest people who started, and you had essentially a New People's Corporation that didn't in any way connect with the old timers in the neighborhood.
Right.
And then they said, we need to create an organization, QBNA, and there was a very contested period of time, because there was actually a new neighborhood organization, I don't even remember the name. Civic, Queen Village Civic, and there was a period, and this Plastic Flower story is part of that story, because there was a New People's Organization, and then Marge and a whole group of people took over QBNA. So there was an Old People's Organization and a New People's, and then there were people like Conrad who had moved in, and myself, I think, who wound up in kind of an intermediary role, who I think saw the incredible value of what was in this neighborhood. And so I think there's been a lot of kind of back and forth, but I think I became a neighborhood activist because I lived, you remember this, right? I lived in a Craig Smith house.
That's right.
I was a tenant, and I began to complain about him, and Ellen and I walked in, that's how I met Kathy. I walked into the Queen Village office, and that's how I got involved in the neighborhood, organizing against Craig Smith.
Well,
So,
and I think there was a lot of that at the time.
I mean, my brother bought his house from Craig on 3rd Street in Seward.
And I bought my house.
Right, so, I mean, in fairness, there were a lot of people who were visionary and who saw value in deteriorated houses. There's no doubt about that.
Our group at that time, or through, up until 72, when mortgage rates went through the roof, we owned over 250 properties,
That's right.
created close to 300 houses for people to move in. And that, to me, is also a big
Yes,
piece
no, that's
of
true.
the modern-day growth of this neighborhood.
That's true.
We would leave from a board meeting, we met across from Waltz on 3rd Street. Second Street. We met across from Waltz, and we would leave our board meeting and walk over to Mario Lanza Park. And, you know, we were young and, you know, as board members and idealists, and we started cleaning out Mario Lanza Park, which was a dump. It had turned into a dump at that time. There were trees that fell down in the middle of it, and we would go from our board meetings and clean that out.
Yeah, I think my perception, though, a lot of the cultural conflict was, you know, people like yourself seeing value in rehabilitating houses and feeling you're doing the right thing, which it was. But let me just finish, though. And then talking about the condition of housing, and then people like Mark saying, well, my neighborhood's not a dump. And so there was kind of a not hearing each other period of time. I think that went on for a
But
decade.
it was more than a lot more than an economic.
There's a spirit about Queen Village that's still there. I mean, I was born and raised in East Oak Lane. It's still up there also. But there was a real spirit here where we used to take people to the bank. The theory being if you could get 2 or 3 houses financed on a block, then other people could come. So people would co-sign and do like that to get people to in here.
Now, my husband's a casualty from Society Hill. He was born at 230 Spruce Street, and he was displaced, okay? But both sets of our parents thought we were crazy. You should move to the burbs like your sister, like your brother, you know, this is what you should do. But when we did it, I mean, I worked for Baker Rothschild, Horn and Bly. I had friends in the neighborhood that were architects. We got some free architectural services, and I wouldn't leave this neighborhood for anything.
Yeah, just
Well,
to me,
one of the disappointments that I've had, and I've lived here since '81. You know, I kind of followed what we had tried to do starting out when I moved out here. One of my disappointments is that a lot of the older families that were here could not buy next to their, or down the street.
They were gentrified very quickly
They
and
were.
moved right
They
out.
absolutely
The
were.
area became gentrified, and they couldn't afford it. And I remember talking with one of my neighbors who said, well, what's our house going for? And I would tell them that I saw the disappointment on this person's face because his daughter was looking for a house and wanted to live near her parents and couldn't do it. A lot of the old African-American families.
people who were
Absolutely.
tenants, people who were tenants were most adverse.
Could not pass them on.
Gentlemen in the back, why don't we spread it around? Put it on the back.
Yeah, like,
I've often wondered at the extent of the destruction of the houses in the vicinity of the I-95. Like almost the whole of the east side of Front Street, on the other side down Queen Street and so forth. And it seems to me that a lot of the houses that were destroyed at that time are directly in the path of the highway. Were there any attempts in this period to negotiate a selection of buildings, or can anybody shed some light on why they came like a...
Look, in the 50s and the 60s, the highway departments had condemnation power. There wasn't a lot of community input into it, as Conrad said. They were the highway department. They just took them. They just took them.
And, you know, they said they needed it for right of way, or,
Right.
you know, so it was virtually impossible.
Well, another tactic, and this is partly with what the other gentleman was saying, was they would issue a plan that said this is going to be a highway, even though they weren't going to do anything. But then gradually people would say, well, gee, why do I want to stay here? Property values would fall. And then they would say, oh, this neighborhood now has become a slum because people aren't maintaining it. So to some extent, there was a self-fulfilling prophecy, or they even caused it. They even caused the effect that justified what they were doing. So there was some of that, but also, as Paul said, that there wasn't much of a neighborhood movement. It really didn't start until the late 60s, I think, the idea of neighborhoods per se.
They also did eminent domain.
Pardon?
They also did eminent domain. We didn't.
Oh, yeah, well, they still have that power.
They
Yeah.
raised that whole section of tenements that were down by the waterfront, or put those apartments. And it basically it was just get the heck out.
Well, Peter, do you have something you want somebody else have a question? I just remember to reflect on something. Oh, Jim, sure, Jim. Why don't you talk a little bit about your wife's family
Yeah.
here so people understand it.
Really?
I came here in the 70s after having served 22 years in active duty as an officer in the United States Army. My wife grew up in this neighborhood. Her father had a business here, still is a business, family business, since the late 20s. And my wife grew up here in school through, and we met in college, etc. I ended up in a transplant from Ohio to Philadelphia after I retired from the Army. And I was wrong because my father-in-law had been involved in the early Southwark organization, and he said, if you're going to live here, you should join the association. So we joined, and some way I was convinced to run for the board. And, Marge recruited me, and only election I ever won. And I ended up on the zoning committee with David, and I saw firsthand the difference between the military and the initiation here.
You guys weren't talking about it.
Yeah. And I stayed on the board until later I became the commissioner of the Department of License and Inspections, and thereafter the managing director. And two of the other than the recovery from the movements event, which I had nothing to do with at the time that I took over after that. The Vine Street Expressway project and the finishing out of the I-95 fiasco, which is a political hot one. And I was the only one on the mayor's cabinet who lived down here. And I was the only one who had been on the board of a community organization such as QB. And I also had a taste of what was the battle here over the ramps. And I had a lot of education from my parents-in-law about this issue as well. So my part was to deal, since the highway, et cetera, came under my supervision in the streets department, with those issues that were spoken today. And so I didn't have a conflict of interest because I'd already resigned. I think Conrad and I left the board at the same time, I believe. So I didn't have a conflict of interest. What I did have was a deep understanding. And I thought that from a standpoint of public service, it really is helpful for people who have had a taste of the problems that neighborhoods have to be in positions to make decisions. And so there were a lot of things that I presented on behalf of the community to the administration and was able to get them through. The great idea about the use of the land underneath the right-of-way, which potential for other uses of that land, but Queen Village has profited, I believe, from that for the parking project, all of which came from the board. And there were a number of other things. The Vine Street project was really as difficult for the city as was I-95. And they came together on the whole issue of how are you going to get traffic from I-95 onto the new Vine Expressway, which it was decided and designed to build that underground. And there were all sorts of problems with that. And all that you did helped to really bring what we have today. I think it's about the best solution that could come out of that, other than not having a ramp.
That reminded me of one funny story that Conrad may remember the name of the person, but when we were working on the I-95 situation, there's the area that's across from South Street, where there's a large green area down there. And I can't remember who the real estate broker was, but we were trying to preserve that area from ramp, so we said we need to come up with a good name for it, so we named it the Meadows.
That's your name.
That's right. And so we called it the Meadows, and then when the city and the federal government was deciding for this double slide under ramp, they had to do an environmental impact statement because they were concerned about wildlife that was in the meadows. We just named it that, and of course the whole EIS.
One of the saddest things I remember is when many of the houses were condemned, and thank goodness we defeated the Crosstown, to which we had a big funeral.
Yes, we
And
did.
we had a casket, and we got a lot of coverage on that. But the houses, the people left the houses, and they were sitting there, and they were some of the most beautiful houses. Specifically, they were on the east side of Front Street, from Bainbridge, from Kenilworth to Bainbridge Street, and they were beautiful homes. And that all those people who had been there 3 and 4 generations left. Many of them died. The elders really died because they just could not adjust going somewhere else, living with their children or whatever. And the houses sat there, and it was like, it was so eerie just to see that strip of houses. We even got a trophy out of the whole deal. They gave us the Ralston School, which is the big school building at American and Bainbridge. We said, we need a community center. They didn't want to see us have a community center. But we fought hard and long, and we got the Ralston School, which was great. It was a beautiful big building. But then we said, what do we do with it? We didn't
David
have
was
any
being
money.
responsible. I remember
I got off the board real
that
quick.
David was concerned about
We
insurance.
didn't have any, we couldn't insure it, we couldn't do anything with it. It was a very sad thing, so we really had to give that up. Subsequent to that, I think I sold that for like $2.5 million.
Well, that's what I wanted to add.
Yeah.
People need to understand, I don't want to embarrass Kathy, but Kathy, as she said, was the secretary in the office who had had no work
And
experience.
how long did they hire her for?
What was
6 months.
6
They
months.
gave us a 6-month
Contract.
contract
Right, but-
that lasted, Carla, what, 34 years? Every month, but we did good stuff, and we were the model.
Right, but see, Kathy was processing the senior citizen applications for utility rebates. And so every single older person in the neighborhood knew Kathy, trusted Kathy, and when it came time to sell their houses, I mean, Kathy's real estate career comes out of working, I think, in Green Village neighborhoods, because everybody knows Kathy, everybody trusted Kathy out of that experience, and so.
My mom used to say to me, when I was working very hard as a social worker and making $18,000 a year, if you could only take your God blesses to the bank, you'd be a millionaire. That's what she said.
And she did.
Yeah.
Gotta be other questions. Sure, Jeff.
Kind of more looking back, but I was wondering, did you, definitely a repercussion of the highway going in because the water line got cut off Delaware. And of course, plans to kind of connect the cities of Delaware have been kicked around for 20 years. So I was wondering what you think about the current plans and what you think is actually going to happen, and will
is the trail we built. I don't know if people know it, but you can go in at Washington Avenue, right between the sheet metal workers and the Coast Guard, and there's a bicycle trail that takes you all the way down to Pier 70. We got money from the William Penn Foundation, and we built it. It hasn't been very well publicized, but I think tomorrow they're dedicating the pier, which is right at the beginning of that. And if you haven't, and you know, I'll just tell this personal story, which is, I mean, I have two stories. There's one, we moved up to the Northwest. I lived in the Mount area for 20 years, and we decided to move back when my oldest daughter went off to college. And we bought a house at 3rd and Pine, and because of what David referred to as the spirit of this name, I can never bring myself to tell anybody I live in Society Hill. So I always tell people, oh, yeah, I live in Center City at 3rd and Pine. You will never hear me. Society Hill was a dirty word for a period of time. But just on that personal note, we moved back. I have a younger daughter, and I was envious of the Schuylkill River Trail, and I thought we were going to go riding on Columbus Boulevard and the bike trails there, which you take it. So we got that first piece of the trail. Now, I think that a bike trail along the edge, I think, is absolutely key. I mean, that map I passed out, I think, is one I'd like to pass out because there are all these arguments. Well, gee, what would happen if you eliminated highways? What could be developed? And we really do have the opposite case being proved there because there had been a highway that was built river to river. This neighborhood would never have taken off as it did. And if you look at Center City today and you look south through Bella Vista, every neighborhood south of Center City is now strong and vibrant. As good as Vine Street is, it's still a wall. And except where the Parkway connects people into Fairmount, there's a tremendous amount of deterioration. So I think we're really at a point, I mean, I'm not going to say tear down the highway, but it was clearly part of a design philosophy for cities that's terribly outmoded. That most cities are investing in high-speed rail, they're investing in bicycle trails, and long-term, that highway doesn't belong there. Whether we can afford it, I agree with David, but it isn't I-95. Don't anybody tell you it's I-95. I-95 is the New Jersey Turnpike, right? It's a regional road that connects South Philadelphia and Delaware up to Bucks County. The real I-95 is someplace else. So I'll go no further than that because we're on tape.
Well, I think there's another answer to the question. I participated, and many other people have done, so I was the only one, in a working group on the new master plan last night, which followed an earlier participation to establish or suggest priorities. And one of the priorities that the Planning Commission has picked up is a greenway along the full run of the Delaware, not just the Center City, the full run of the Delaware all the way up. And it was a high priority for the Planning Commission, and as I observed the working group that I was in, and others as well, everybody that was in that room, and there were 100 people or more, saw it as a high priority for the dollars. So I have very little doubt that that is going to really happen.
Yeah, all you have to do is ride your bike on the Schuylkill to understand the power of access to the waterfront, and it's clearly what has to happen here.
There's a great movie, if anybody could find it, that was done in the early 50s, where Ed Bacon and some of his other people actually show their plans for highways all around the city, the outer circumferential and the inner circumferential. So I don't know if that still exists, but I remember seeing that years ago. And it sort of expresses this out-of-date mentality that Paul was talking about.
I have to take blood pressure pills before watching.
Ed, before you speak, I just want to say one thing, having nothing to do with this, but there's a wonderful old viaduct that used to be where the trains came into the Reading Terminal Market. And it was cut off, obviously, years ago. There are ways to get up there, and if you really want to see a piece of land in this city that goes all the way out to the suburbs, and it's all elevated, go up there and just look at that. That is the recreational place and a transportation corridor for bicycles, et cetera, that's just beyond belief, and it's just sitting there rotting away.
That was on the map too.
Was it?
Yeah, that was on the map.
Well, just for that gentleman over there, and anybody else that's interested, if you're interested in what the current thinking is as far as the waterfront, I would refer you to Penn Praxis website and also Delaware Waterfront Corporation's website to get a good idea of what that plan looks like, which just became public this month. And I just wanted to say this, that when Kathy and
house.
And the chicken
And the chicken house.
And more importantly, it was reported that one of the neighbors down there did shoot and kill the chicken man's truck. Okay, just so you'll know, you're not more crazy.
We'll add that to the list.
Right, so, we actually feel we owe you gratitude for the work that you guys, all of you, Conrad, starting with Conrad, I remember Rick Sirianni, who's not here tonight,
Yep.
have done to help build this neighborhood. We like to think that Sweetsport, which was reported at the time as being a Tony development on the waterfront, helped to get attention focused in. It's been a hell of a ride for these 30 years.
You know, what I think, just speaking about today, that's so remarkable is for years, every corner store with a few were vacant. And what's been remarkable in the last 5 years is to see corner stores come back as coffee shops, as kids' clothing stores, to see what's happened on 4th Street and filling in. And what I think, you know, what you need to understand is, except for Fairmount, there is no other neighborhood in the city that has many families raising kids. Here, 26% of households in this neighborhood have children.
I love having kids.
Yeah, and that is a sea change, because everyone who had kids used to leave, and you're at the cutting edge here in terms of the most families with kids in the city now, and obviously Meredith is part of that, McCall is part of that further north, but it's really a transformation here to see kids' clothing stores and kids' bookstores, right? I mean, those were all going out of business in the 70s and stuff. Right?
Well, it's funny, Kathy and I had a conversation, just about a week or so ago, because Kathy grew up in the courtyard where we live, and she was lamenting at one point the fact that there used to be children all over the courtyard, playing and writing and carrying on. And when we first moved in there, which was probably about 8 years ago, it was desolate. And now there are a few more kids. I mean, not a ton of them. And there are times when they're riding their big wheels at 6 o'clock in the morning, which is a bit much. But we get a lot of dogs. We get dogs all over the place. And to see that vibrancy come back.
Yeah, I mean, just in the 2000 census, there were 2,900 school-age children in Center City. And according to health department records, 18,000 children have been born to Center City parents since 2000, just to give you a sense of how big that change is. And probably only New York and Boston have more families with kids in the downtown now. So and this is really the leading neighborhood in there.
What effect will that have on the schools in the city?
Well, I mean, as I said, you go to Meredith, 70% of the kids are from this neighborhood, and the neighborhood to the south. I mean, McCall is the school for Chinatown, and many kids in this neighborhood. It's clearly the cutting edge thing. The schools have got to really accommodate that. And then the 3 independent schools in the downtown, Friends Select, St. Peter's, and Philadelphia, are 75% Center City families. So it's a total change. It's a total change.
And also Nevenger.
Right, Nevenger, right, absolutely. Right,
Our work,
absolutely.
my apologies.
No, I didn't say Nevenger, I said Meredith, so.
You got St. Mary's too.
Right,
Nevenger.
And St. Philip.
Right.
Right, but Nevenger, a lot of folks are now working with the new principal over at Nevenger to try to focus some attention on getting that school the resources that it needs to do a good job. And that could be a great asset to this community.
There's 2 things I'd like to comment on aside from highways and ramps and cross towns. Did a lot of other stuff at Queen Village.
Yep.
There was great people like Marge Schernecke. I have a funny story to tell about her. She coined the CICCS. It took me a long time to learn those words, but we had a wonderful group. It was called the Citizens to Investigate the Criminal Court System. So what we did is we had some crime in the neighborhood. We would go to every arraignment. Again, not having text messages or emails, we had phone banks where we would call and say, there's an arraignment tomorrow. There was a burglary or whatever happened. We would find out when the person was being arraigned. We'd go and stand in front of the judge and sort of stare him down. 15 of us standing there. He daresn't let that person in. So, and then if he did, we stood outside of the polling place with a list of the judges that we liked and who was receptive to the people, and it worked, honest to goodness.
Tell the balloon story you told about the
We
card.
had
This one has to,
we had, one that, what was that? Oh, we went to, it was, one of the CICCSs, we decided that we found out that it was going to be Bring Your Children to Work Day, the judges. So Marge and Marge said, I know what we could do. We could, let's stage the criminal court system is a circus. So we all got dressed up in clown outfits, balloons, popcorns. We got as far into the hallway that we could. We couldn't park. I had my 4 children. We all got arrested. We went in, we rushed in, and we left the balloons go up, spilled the popcorn over. They came in, and it was something else. But it was an experience. But we were hurt. We really were, and it was something.
I didn't know you were never
We also had a Queen Village Tea Party.
Yeah, we had a tea
A
party.
Boston Tea Party when all of our taxes were raised. We took all of the assessments, and we had a lot of coverage, and we took them all down to the Delaware River, and we threw them in the river. And we took appeals, didn't we?
We did.
We stood on our own merits and stood with all of our seniors and fought their cases, and honest to goodness, we won. We would bring bags of brick dust with us saying that the houses are falling apart. We'd get this little old lady standing in front of the judge saying, these places are falling apart. Look at what you assessed it. It's terrible. And they're saying, my house isn't falling apart. They didn't understand what we're trying to do.
They missed it, yeah.
But we won. We honest to goodness won most every case.
But there's still a lot of battles out there. There's still a lot to do. I'd be remiss not to tell you that right now the civic groups are not in the forefront of the concern of the political people. They've been knocked out in numerous situations where they've lost their power. The state Supreme Court ruled that civic groups can't appear as zoning cases anymore. And this was never appealed by the administration in any way, shape, or form. And any candidate for anything that you're ever near, ask them what they think about civic associations. Because during this period of time, the associations were king. They made an election. And I mean, if you look at it right now, the ward leaders of any party, the committee people of any party, they don't mean anything to any of you. They say to you, vote this way or that way. You really could care less. You've made up your own mind. You have the internet, you have TV, you have all kinds of ways of gathering information that people 50 years ago didn't have. But also, what's happened in its own quiet way is the role of the civic group now has been minimized to a point where they're not effective the way they used to be in the systems, you know, and this is something that you have to pick up the rallying cry.
They're a lot weaker. One of the things that David had recommended, Jeff, and I had brought to the attention of the anti-casino group, you know, which is a very important decision being made tomorrow, as we all know, right? I mean, there's always something that we have to fight against. But one of the things that David had said a long time ago, he said, if I was active in that, every one of those partners involved have an interest, okay? Put their pictures up there. Do you think that the people who are partners and put their pictures down where the site is?
6 foot by 6 foot on the
That's
fence, and that would end it right there.
They wouldn't go for it. They're too soft. We gotta get some.
Today, and especially in today's economy, okay, I can tell you that if the answer to both those things, and what you said, David, which incidentally is arguable that civics aren't totally powerless, and a lot of work has been going on as far as working with the ZCC, the Zoning Code Commission, and everything else to try to balance things out. Unfortunately, it's a very, very good friend of mine who always said, it's about the USD, and you know who that is.
I know.
And
That's all it's about.
It's about the USD, and, you know, and that's not all bad, but, you know, you gotta remember that these developers now are pushing back real hard. And, you know, they are trying to minimize the power of the civic. And unfortunately, in some cases, that power has been abused. And we're trying to do is address it in a rational way, where we possibly can. Of course, the casino issue is a whole other thing.
Right.
And we have some plans for that too. And I haven't heard any fat lady singing, you know, or even any singers, you know.
Jeff,
So,
it's time for people to pick up the mantle. There's a lot of people in the room, younger people. It's time to go back and reorganize.
and back to the future.
Take a look at what's happening and where we can better ourselves. Queen Village has always been on the cutting edge when it's come to this kind of thing. And by the way, we did use the kiss and hit principle between maybe Marge and I on one side and the others on the other. And maybe that works, maybe it doesn't. It might have worked in this situation. But there's a real need today for people to get involved and to let the political leaders know that they do vote. And this, they will vote as a block, as Queen Village. They won't vote as a D or an R, but they'll vote as a Queen Village. I think your Tea Party today is proving that people are publicly going away from the standard system, people who never would have. This is really important, and it's important for Queen Village once again to step up and take the forefront in the battle. And I think you are, and I think there's some people in this room that should really be joining you, and I wish them good luck.
Well, it's, you know, it's 40 years, you know, since I think it was 2006 in November when the edict came down that Oxford would be built or Reed, and there is not a stick or a stone in the ground.
How many people here are residents of Queen Village? Oh, wow, everybody.
Are there
Also, I think the one thing that we have to keep in mind too, you brought up the Tea Party, and I'm not kind of.
We're not going political at all here.
But we also have to make a point to not make ourselves as a group look like lunatics when we want to get something accomplished.
You're hired.
There's a way to do it. There's a way to do it without sounding crazy. So, I think we have to keep that in mind, regardless of our personal politics. Just, we have things that need to be accomplished for this community, and we can do it by saying no, by saying yes, but not being crazy.
Yeah, it's one of the best neighborhoods in the city.
It is.
Okay.
Is there anyone else here who hasn't asked their question or made their comment? We don't have to.
Are you sitting at home?
I just wanted to make a final comment that one of the things that's really important is that diversity is a basis of strength, but it also takes a lot of work.
Yeah.
And sometimes people want to take shortcuts and just bypass, and that doesn't work. But when you have a diverse community, you can be stronger than almost any other community. But you have to have done the work to talk to people and to reconcile the different interests, and that's the hard part. So whatever bit of wisdom there, but that's still the task for a place like Queen Village.
Well, could we ask for a final comment?
Oh, before, I have one question, actually.
Okay.
I was curious, you mentioned a lot of the people died that were displaced. But beyond the ones that died, where did they go? Where were they moved?
Majority moved to Pensport.
Pensport?
Past Washington Avenue. Their children.
And so, and the government bought their homes, and they were able to buy?
They were, like, for $2,500 and $5,000 for their homes in the early 70s.
Did you know a lot of them?
We did know many of them.
Did anyone ever do a follow-up study of them and see what happened?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting
Just
story.
just from us being a neighbor and knowing that, like, all you did hear for the next 2 or 3 years, that, oh, did you hear Mrs. So-and-so died? It was really a dark, horrible time. It really was. And many of them did die. They really did. And they longed to come home. It was like putting them in a nursing home or something. They wanted to come home. And I live in Workman Place, and I see people staring in and saying, oh, my aunt lived there, or walking down Pemberton Street and saying, oh gosh, this is such a great neighborhood, I used to live here. So no marble steps being drugged up the street from all the poachers and beautiful mantles. It was an awful, awful time. But on a happier note, I think I would like to say that so many good things came, and anybody can do whatever we did as radicals in the same way. You don't have to be a radical, just anybody can do it. The casino is at my heart, is that we just wished we had more people out there fighting and trying to stop it. It isn't there. The road is there, ours is not. And it really is due to a lot of people's hard work. Jeff and Don, they go to all the meetings, and Ed, Bill, they all go to hundreds of meetings, just like we did in the 70s. There's another whole regime that's doing the same thing. It's invisible, but it's certainly, our neighborhood is not, you don't get this kind of a neighborhood by right. You really don't. You have to work at it every day through the wonderful thing that Barry Promise does for us is our sound barrier park. Do you think those plants, and they get mowed by themselves, or do you think all the seasonal plantings? I sell lots of houses because he keeps it so beautiful. It's like, it's a tribute to walk from Washington Avenue all the way up to Lombard Street and see all those beautiful plants. People like Gail and Don who transformed Marier Laza Park. You wouldn't walk through it. You would be scared to go through it. Now I take people there to pout, just to shout about how wonderful it is and what a great job that you did. But there's so many people. Mike, you sit on the zoning board so many nights, and Peter, how many times you've given up your time. So there's a lot of Mike, yeah. And the other thing that once we got the sound barriers, we stopped the billboards, we got the sound barrier park, we got it maintained. Then we said, oh goodness, now how are we going to get to Penn's Landing? And that was Marge's baby. She said, let's do, what else could we ask for? We used to like saying, how can we keep one step ahead of them? Marge said, let's get a bridge. Let's get a bridge.
But it was really, part of the compromise and part of the learning experience was that there was a fellow who worked for the city. It was Ron Donata, and there was another guy whose name starts with a C.
Rick Committa?
It wasn't Rick Committa. No, but what he said, he worked for the city, I don't know if it was public property, one of those departments. He used to be down there at Penn's Landing Corp with, who was the head of Penn's Landing Corp? Dominic, yes, 17. He was, on the staff down there. And he said, put a parking lot down there. Jim Carrata.
Oh, Jimmy Carrata.
Put a parking lot down there, they'll get you the bridge. Commerce Department, right. And I mean, it worked.
By the way,
But
Marge, you'll be very happy to hear that one of the first things in the new plan that's maintained now, that's being developed by the Waterfront Corporation, is the extension of the South Street Bridge all the way over Delaware Avenue.
Really?
Into the open.
Take it over.
How about it? Yeah, they're reconnecting us with our heritage that they removed how many years ago.
My closing remark would just be, because I'm sitting here thinking about this whole thing, and then I'm watching basically another generation come up behind us, but it just occurred to me, and you can go mentally through the list, how many other groups are neighbor associations compared to civic associations? And this is Queen Village Neighbors Association. And there's a warmth there, and there's a communal gathering. I don't know how to describe it, but we never thought of ourselves as a civic association. We were neighbors, and we always referred to each other as the neighbors and people like that. So it's something I was very, very proud to be part of at that time. And quite frankly, I'm very, very proud right now to be part of at this time. I'm not active in Queen Village, but I'm watching what's happening in Queen Village, and there's still a great group of people doing the same exact thing, and it's being passed on. So I want to thank you for what you're doing now, and we all live together.
I want to thank all of you for this evening. This has been amazing as far as I'm concerned. Many of my questions are answered. There's still many I have, but I'll continue to, sir, what are you trying to?
Paul, are we going down the line with closing comments, I think? Were you wrapping up? You guys have some last.
I just wanted to thank you, Cynthia, and you,
Right,
Jane,
absolutely.
for organizing.
To give Kathy and everyone an award for tonight, a little award, a little memento for all their hard work that we so appreciate.
Oh, that's not
Something
my
to
notes.
remember. It's the original pins from back in the day.
All right.
You don't know how great that really is. You have no idea.
And if everyone could show their appreciation for all their hard work.